Some of the questions were identical, so those that were identical, we got out.
Okay, so I was just told that some questions were identical, and so if it was identical, we're just doing it once, not twice. First question, is coastal commission properties exempt? We have a coastal zone along the coast. There's lots of special rules there. No, today the same rules apply across the city, whether you're in the coastal zone or not in terms of home sharing. Some cities have done it a little differently and have stricter or looser rules, but not the city of Los Angeles. This is a three-part question. When I register my listings on Airbnb with my tax ID, exempt? When I register my listing on Airbnb with my tax ID, exempt is... I need someone to help me, all right? Does anybody know what this question was?
Yeah, I can read it. I think that's my question.
Go for it.
When I register my listing on Airbnb with my tax ID, is it exempt from the city registration? As far as my
Is what
business,
exempt?
the properties under a business license, that they're taxable under my business ID.
What's your question?
Are they exempt from the city's registration?
What register? From this home sharing registration?
Correct.
No, everyone has to register for home sharing.
Even if it's listed under the platform as a business?
Yeah, totally separate, yeah. You'll have to come through and register like everyone else.
Right.
Okay, if I am not registered after November 1st and I have confirmed reservations beyond November 1st, will I be able to honor them or will I have to cancel them? Important question. So home sharing needs to be done, short-term rentals need to be done with a registration number. We know many of you have future bookings, may have made them by mistake, maybe you made them on purpose, but the idea is that no, the short-term rental activity really should cease. You can switch to a 30-day or more calendar and do 30 more day listings, but the short-term rentals really should not be happening, and you would be subjecting yourself to possible enforcement action.
We were told
I'll tell you, there is some discussion on this with some platforms. There's the ability to enter into a platform agreement with platforms that come in and sign an agreement, legal agreement with the city. That platform agreement does allow for some slight modifications to some processes and procedures. This could be something that, if we get in a platform agreement with the platform, there's some arrangement that may be particular, but the advice right now is that no, any home sharing activity should only occur with a registration number. If you do not have one.
So can I make a comment on that? How is the city prepared to manage, all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have made reservations for, let's say, November 20th for Thanksgiving, for example, and they're coming from overseas, and they made the reservations like, even like 6 months ago, before you guys announced this.
Yeah, so I
How are
was
you
generous,
gonna-
but I'm going to try to just stick to
Okay.
the asking. But generally, my understanding is Airbnb tries to make alternative reservations for folks.
There's not enough housing to supply for all this.
I don't know that that's true or not, but I believe that's up to your platforms to try to rearrange and
But they
help
haven't
folks with their living.
Not-
So what if you have over 120 days in 2019? How long does extended hosting last? For example, I registered in July.
They're gonna cancel. Get the tenants info.
Blah, blah, blah. I think, so this is, I think, going to the question that I said, of it's 120 days per calendar year. So if you registered in July, you've got 120 days starting in July till the end of the year in your bank.
Chargebacks.
No, so it's, no, so it's 120 days is calculated, adding them all up. We're always talking about less than 30-day stays. We add all those up to 120. If it's a 45-day stay, we don't count that towards the number, but we add up all the short-term stays to 120. When you get to January, your bank, you get 120 days in your bank account again to start in January. So the 120 days is tied to calendar year. Your registration is tied to when you register. So you register in July, you'll register again in July, but the 120 is on the calendar year.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're gonna give you a card back there to get the question down, and we'll bring it up.
I turned one of my rooms in my house to 30 nights. I turned one of the rooms in my house to 30 or more nights, but I have some short-term reservations from 4 months ago. Is that allowable? I think that's a similar answer that I just gave. It's not at this point. I have a property with one address. It has two structures, a main house and a guest house. Can we rent out both structures? Not simultaneously. My wife and I move back and forth between the structures, thank you kindly. So I think so. Everything's a little case specific. If it's a true dwelling unit with a kitchen and it's permitted as a true rental unit, then no. But if it's a converted structure and it's safe and it's habitable and you've been to the building department and they've confirmed that it's safe for people to stay in, then yes, your primary residence can include your entire property, including accessory structures, as long as they're not a separate unit. They don't have a kitchen, is what usually makes it a unit. So yes, you could have a listing for your main home and a listing for your accessory. As long as you don't do them simultaneously, that should be okay. Again, we want you to tell us about that you have two listings, so report them, and there should be no issues with that.
Sorry, thank you.
What is the purpose of informing neighbors? It infringes on your right to privacy and potential safety risk. So I think I mentioned a little bit, this was something that came through the public process when we started talking about allowing people to go year-round. Home sharing was usually being thought about as having a cap. At a certain point, we were asked to talk about, what about if we get rid of the cap? And one of the considerations was, well, that's like a full-time use. That's a little more than just sort of accessory home sharing. And your neighbors came out and told us that they would like to know about it. The idea is, again, not giving your neighbor a veto power, but empowering neighbors to say if there is problems, they know where to turn. Neighbors can know that this is legal and not illegal. That way I think there's some value in neighbors knowing that you're legit and you're not doing something underground. And so this will tell them you're going through the proper channels. If you have any problems, here's the complaint line. But this is something that neighbors felt was important, city council felt was important. When we're allowing you to go full-time, year-round, it's a more intensive use. And at least let neighbors know how to handle any problems that may arise. Our reservations grandfathered in, same question I think. Here we've got a second question on clarifying RSO, rent control units, and ADUs. How do they work together? Okay, get ready, this is complicated. Okay, so now we know what an ADU is, right?
Ask the question again, please.
Yeah, so accessory dwelling unit is a full second, usually it's only a second unit on a lot. It's usually never a third unit. It's got a specific label because it's something the state of California allowed, and it trumps all local zoning rules. So like LA, like most cities, did not allow second units in single family neighborhoods. The state said we're gonna allow it. So it has a special status that allows you to go around a lot of local codes. The question is, how does that work with the RSO? So that's a great question. Because I mentioned the RSO, the rent control laws kick in when you add that second unit. So now you've got a second unit. So let me finish. The property itself becomes subject to the rent control ordinance because now you have two units on a lot. However, ADUs, because they're just recently built and not pre-1978, they're exempt. So the ADU becomes exempt statutorily, but the main home does become subject to the rent control ordinance if it was built before 1978. Yeah, basically, what's that? That's ADUs. I know it's very confusing. ADUs have this weird 2017 cutoff. Pre-2017 ADUs are good. They can be used without a primary residence.
It doesn't matter if it's a kitchen or not a kitchen.
Right.
I'm sorry.
ADUs have kitchens or a full dwelling. Just think of an ADU as a full-on dwelling unit.
So a full-blown kitchen, and I can still home share that, but it has to have a full-blown kitchen, right? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So an accessory dwelling unit is a very specific thing. You would probably know if you have one because you have to ask for it. They're not gonna let you have a second unit unless it's called an ADU. So some people may think they have an ADU, it's just a backyard structure. It's probably not, but it may be. You may have recently built it as an ADU and you would probably know that it is. Again, it's rules of, if it's a post-2017 permit, then home sharing is banned in that ADU. Pre-2017, it's allowed. But adding that second unit does mean you're now subject to the rent control laws, which does subject you to the rules in the home sharing ordinance.
Don't you think we should have all been told that before
Ma'am,
we built
please,
them?
please answer, please just fill it out, please, we can't just have everyone.
Well, you can't fill that out.
About 8 years ago, I pulled permits to connect And accessory living quarters. Oh my God, we're getting really planning nerdy here. Okay, I'll explain this. Accessory living quarter, not an accessory dwelling unit, accessory living quarter. Accessory living quarter actually is a backyard structure that is meant for guests. It is our defined thing that has always been around that says you could have a backyard structure and allow guests to stay there. It's safe, it's habitable. However, it's hard to get them because they're only allowed in larger lots. We're considering maybe changing that. But right now, you could have something, if you're on a 10,000 square foot lot, you can go into the building department and say, I want an accessory living quarter. And that becomes a place for guests. And we explicitly said that can be used for home sharing. It's not a unit. It doesn't have a kitchen. So it's fine. If it's a unit, full unit with a kitchen, we treat it like any other home. But these accessory living quarters can be used for home sharing because they're safe, they're habitable, they're meant for guests. Let me get to the question. Okay, I have an ALQ, an accessory living quarter. Oh, you converted it into a granny flat, which is another term we use for ADUs. I think they turned their accessory living quarter into an ADU.
Granny flats are ADUs.
Put a kitchen in, and now the house is classified as 2 units. Both have now the RSO designation. We just talked about that. We don't want a long-term renter, but would like to rent an Airbnb. Can we do this? We cannot. We know the answer, right? We cannot. If it's post-2017, we cannot. If it's pre-2017, you can. If it's a post-2017 conversion, you cannot. I think I've talked a lot about that, so I'll leave that there. Where are we at? Oh, let's see my piles. Okay, so my 120 days are up. I apply for an extension. I think they mean extended home sharing. They applied for extended home sharing. How long does that take? May I keep renting in the meantime? It should be the same general process. It takes a little bit longer because of the notification process. So, but if you've got that taken care of, and hopefully we have very good instructions of how to do that. It's a bit of a process, getting the mailing labels, going to a company to send them out. That's all hopefully explained on our website. That does take a little bit more preparation. We basically just ask that you show that you've done the mail out. When you're going through the online system, you upload that, yes, I did my mail out already. And at that point, it's just like regular home sharing. You will get immediately, if you meet all the criteria, you get through our gauntlet, you pay your fee, you should be issued immediately your pending registration number for extended and begin to go year round once you get that.
I answered that, I just want to say.
Okay, extended home sharing is valid for 1 year, not in a calendar year like 120 days. We've talked about that, right? Is it? I know it's confusing. I'll say it one more time. Extended home sharing allows you to go year round. And since there's no cap, it doesn't really matter. You just have that ability to do constant as much home sharing as you'd like. Once you have your extended home sharing registration, you have now the ability to go without any caps. You just need to keep renewing. So again, if you apply here in November for extended, you would be reminded in next November to renew. And as long as you keep your renewal and registration active, and don't let it lapse, you would be able to just do full-time home sharing forever and ever, as long as you keep renewing. Once it lapses, obviously you lose that ability to do extended during that time. So don't let that happen. When do you see active enforcement starting? Who knows the answer? November 1st. Right, so that's the correct answer. Yes, November 1st. Honestly, like we're starting November 1st. That's when we're going to start looking for the illegal listings. But it'll be a process before any fines. I've mentioned warning letters. We're going to be very nice at first. It's a misunderstanding. Eventually, though, there will probably be 2 warnings. Again, then there will lead to an actual fine or citation. Off-back alley. How many neighbors are to be informed? Okay, yes, good. Okay, I mentioned when we have to inform neighbors because they've extended. I mentioned it's your abutting, so your property's touching your property. It's the 3 properties across the street, 1, 2, 3, and it is. Thank you. It's the 3 properties also behind you. They could be touching, or if you have an alley, we treat an alley like a street. So it's the 3 properties, sort of one directly behind you, one to the left, one to the right, usually. Unless you run a weird grid and it could only be 1 or 2. but most of them are touching, technically, we consider 3 and 3 in the front and back. I think we have instructions actually on that. When you go through our administrative guidelines, give you a little more guidance and have little maps. And staff will help you with that as well. If a house has an ADU, can the main house be rented short-term? That again gets, I think, to the question of when you add that ADU, your lot becomes subject to the rent stabilization ordinance RSO, and therefore the whole property is not. The exception would be it's a newer house, post 1978, then it's categorically exempt and not. But if that main home was built before 1978, even if it's owner occupied, we've talked about this, it's the housing department considers that subject to the rent control. They say it's a temporary exemption, but you're still subject. It can go back to rent control at any time. So that does mean this. If it's true ADU, if it's a true second dwelling, again, I think a lot of times people may not be sure whether it is, but if it's 2 official units, including an official ADU and a main home, that's 2 official units, that would be subject to rent control. Zemus does tell you if we think you're subject to the rent control ordinance. Yes, it does. I showed you, you go to Zemus, click on housing, and it'll tell you if we have it on our list or not. Again, you could always challenge us and tell us we're wrong. It's wrong information. All these, all right. How we doing on time? You all right? We're gonna get through?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I registered for home sharing. I now have an extended home sharing. Congratulations. Do I need to renew both permits? No. You're gonna be operating under the extended from now on, unless you wanna go back to regular. But once you have your extended, that's the more generous one, that's year round. So you don't need to worry about a regular anymore. You're on extended and you would just renew upon the date you got your extended.
Can you just start extended if you know you're gonna do the 120 and not pay, just say before you've reached the 120?
Yes, you can do it anytime with those limitations. You saw, you gotta do it for 6 months, have your regular for 6 months, or be renting short-term for 60 days.
Right.
And you would show that, but once you hit that
After
threshold,
November
anytime.
1st?
Yeah, you don't have to wait till you get to 119 or anything like
Right.
that. Once you hit those qualifications, you're eligible. I saw that an ordinance passed making all of California rent control. AB 1463, I think, or something. How can you then prevent rent control from registering? So that is state law, and generally that state law does not affect the RSO in cities that have rent control regulations already. So the state law actually does expand rent control to a new class of properties, but not rent stabilization ordinance. I am 99% sure, I haven't checked with the housing department on this, but the regulations apply to the city's rent stabilization ordinance. These additional properties that may come in, I think it's now a rolling 15-year kind of marker of buildings that are subject to rent control. So I think up to 2005 buildings that are multifamily now would have some rent caps and some no-fault eviction protections. But that is not RSO. My 99.9% read is that those post, from 78 to 2005, these new buildings that come into the state rent control are not affected by our regulations, which only talk about our local RSO. 99.9% sure.
How about if somebody completely gutted the inside of their house, remodeled and redid everything? Is it still considered an RSO?
Maybe, maybe not. So I talked about in the beginning, there's a very official process to remove rental units from the rental market under the RSO, under state law. It's called an Ellis Act removal, remember? So if you went through that process, you officially removed your unit from the rental market, you filled out all the paperwork, you gave your tenant relocation, you did all the right things, you might be allowed, but we did put a little caveat for people converting mostly duplexes to single family. That is something we were particularly concerned about, and so there's a 5-year ban on properties that went from 2 units to 1 unit through that process. But if it was decommissioned, if it was taken out of the rental market some other way, was not a duplex, a single family, any other scenario, then if it's not rent controlled, it's not rent controlled. It just depends on case by case. A remodel by itself doesn't mean you're out of rent control, but sometimes people do remodels as part of removing their tenant, and then remove from the rental market. It's a case by case, so I don't know your particular situation. You could again check on our ZMIS, you could check with the housing department. They will have the latest information. Can we use the complaint hotline number for parties with neighbors who have long-term tenants? You could try. I mean, they're not going to hang up on you. But really, they're meant to, that complaint hotline, I showed that phone number, the 24/7. We set that up mostly for short-term rental complaints. There is a separate party house ordinance passed by city council, I think a year or two ago. That's not the real name. It's like unruly nuisance. Maybe you guys know. You guys enforce it? You ever party house? No? Nowhere?
Yeah, if it's loud.
There you go.
well,
See?
Yeah. Respond. If you guys call us, we go.
Yeah, so LAPD is responsible for enforcing that ordinance, as far as I know. So it's a whole separate there is an ability to enforce against unlicensed, unruly parties. I think there's actually a process you could come register if you're doing a party the right way. But if you don't have that party registration, again, nothing to do with home sharing, separate ordinance. But there is new enforcement capabilities, new tools, and the Los Angeles Police Department would respond to calls for loud complaints if they're not too busy with many more important things. But that's the general line, is that the 311 or non-emergency LAPD line would probably handle those calls. And
877 Ask LAPD.
thank you. 877 Ask LAPD will respond whether it's a short-term rental or not. But if you know it's a short-term rental, you may want to call the complaint. You could also go directly to that line as well. Yeah.
Just along the same lines of that, I'm just wondering where the city draws the line between people filing complaints against short-term rentals